Panther's decided to join me today. It's kind of funny because he hasn't been around for a little bit. 101 Ways to Find a Ghost was published in 2011. It's essential tools, tips, and techniques to uncover paranormal activity. Whether you're new to the paranormal and thinking about if you would like to be an investigator, or if you've been investigating for a while, this book has a lot of interesting information, good tips, and things to consider when you're doing an investigation. I always recommend also that if it's an author or a subject you're not familiar with, then be sure to check out your local library to see if they have a copy of the book and give it a test run and see if it's something of interest to you. I also recommend going to Goodreads as there are reviews on books there by a number of folks like myself who enjoy reading and share their opinions about the different books they read. The book is divided into 10 sections. She begins with preparation. Her comment about the general goal of paranormal investigating, another term that's used is ghost hunting, is to investigate, to research, and document what you find. Throughout the book, she focuses and mentions quite a bit about the documentation required, and I'll talk more about that throughout the different sections. She also talks about the importance of credibility and respectability. In other words, what you're doing does have an impact on other researchers and the field of the paranormal in general. She talks about the equipment that you need, and she goes through a list of basic things to have with you, as well as talking about record keeping and the importance of what kinds of things you should be making note of. So much like Richard Palmisano talking about temperature, weather, a number of other factors that could impact the evidence that you find, and making sure that you're keeping clear and concise records. On page 8, she talks about the importance of educating yourself. And this is, I believe, very important. If you're entering the field of the paranormal, then you should have an idea of what you're getting into. And yes, in some ways, just going out there and doing it, hands-on education, but there are a number of things that you should be aware of before you ever go out and do your first investigation. There are a lot of energies and entities and various situations that you should have an idea about before you begin with this. On page 8, she says, if you decide you want to pursue a career as a paranormal investigator, whether as a hobby or a professional, you should gather a library of reference materials and educate yourself about the many sorts of unexplained phenomena and hauntings. It is quite a large subject area, and it's good to get a foundation and information about what you're getting into before you start. It's something that I enjoyed hearing about from Kindred Paranormal when I joined a live chat a few weeks ago. Prior to going out and beginning their investigations, they did some research and looked into the field first and then began doing things. I'll leave a link to their channel down below. She mentions the importance of checking your sources, and I agree. Whether you're reading a book, a website, or a social media post, or even watching a YouTube video, always be sure to double check and consider the source and information. She also talks about taking classes in the paranormal, and again, be sure that the person who is offering courses, whether in person or online, is someone who is credible. So maybe ask around if they've had other students and speak to the instructor before you decide to sign up. She also gives a handy checklist on page 10 of the different things that should be covered in a class. She also mentions going to conferences. If you're someone who does traveling and you enjoy doing that type of thing, then it's a great place to network, make connections, and talk to other people who are already in the field. Part 2, Haunts and Haunt Spots. On page 26 to 30, she gives definitions, so it's a good resource. If you've seen my earlier video on paranormal definitions, and I'll have that linked in the description box down below, then you know different people use different terms, sometimes interchangeably, or they've defined them differently. So it's good to check out a couple of different sources to figure out what they mean when they're referring to something like a poltergeist or a ghost. On page 35, she talks about a residual haunting and what does that mean and why are people able to see some of them and what are they picking up by that. Part 3, Practical Skills and Work on Location. She goes over protocols and procedures. This is for people who are serious about doing an investigation. She has some do's and don'ts. So before you even go out, it's handy to go over what equipment do you need? Do you have a safety plan? Do you have backup plans? Do people know where you're going? A number of different factors to consider. She talks about the record keeping, doing interviews with clients, getting the information. She stresses the importance of clients' privacy, something that unfortunately Hollywood and some others seem to ignore. Sadly, a case in particular that I can think of where that was ignored was the Conjuring House. And unfortunately, because that address was given out in the movie, two of the owners now of the property, since the parents, have put it up for sale because they got tired of the people just showing up 24/7 and feeling entitled to come and do an investigation. She also talks about integrity and accountability. Again, because even though maybe some people are just doing this for entertainment, sadly, not all of them are forthcoming about that. And that tends to reflect negatively on the researchers who are actually trying to do investigations, come up with evidence and information to provide data and credible, reliable information. Part 4 is an analysis and review of what you've captured during your investigation and looking at the material afterwards. She mentions that it does take hours of reviewing footage after you've done the investigation. Many investigators sit in one location or stay at one location for hours, anywhere from 3 to 8 hours or more. And while they're there, they're capturing footage, and all of that needs to be reviewed and looked at. It's good to have two people doing it together if possible. And the reason for that is maybe one of you has missed something on the screen, or one of you has heard something a bit different, so the two of you can sit and analyze. On page 72, she uses the term matrixing. In other words, when people are looking at an image or listening to different things, they may see or hear something because our mind tries to put a label on things and identify it. Another term similar to that is pareidolia. So when you're looking at clouds, sometimes people see different images. So that's something to keep in mind when you're reviewing your footage. She also talks about digital storage, and again, this comes to clearly labeling and making sure that you have backups of the material that you have gathered. Section 5, she speaks specifically to psychic skills. On page 84 and 85, She provides definitions of the types of psychic abilities. In this chapter, she also goes through necromancy, which is people who talk with the dead, dowsing. Most commonly, people think of that in terms of finding water, but a number of psychic investigators also use dowsing to communicate with spirits. And she finishes the chapter with scrying and mentions Nostradamus, probably one of the most famous people known for scrying and writing out his findings. Part 6 is about self-defense and protection. It's a very important chapter to review and concepts to consider. It's something that, unfortunately, not many of the investigators that I've seen on YouTube anyway talk about very much. And it's not that I think they need to mention it, of course, every single week, but for people who are watching it who may not be familiar with some of the different things happening, I do think it is important to be mindful and aware that if you're doing this type of work and research, it's important to know different things that you should be doing to protect and keep your own aura clear, to keep your home protected, and to ensure that if you're out and about doing investigations, you're not bringing things back to your home. At the beginning of this chapter, she does mention that investigating can be, coming across something as harmless as a residual haunting, spirits that are rather noisy and mischievous, but you can also come across some very dark and dangerous entities. So it's important to know how to protect yourself against that. She goes on to mention only very foolish or immature people dabble in the occult without proper preparation and precaution. First, if the word occult is throwing you for a loop, be sure to check out my video on paranormal definitions. It isn't scary woo-woo stuff. It is not an area for dabblers. In other words, it's not an area for people who just want to be spoon-fed information. It is definitely an area for lifelong learners who continue searching and investigating, whether that's going to a site or going through books or websites. But it is definitely an area for people who are motivated to learn and continue learning. There's a difference between a haunting and mental health. And it is very important to make sure that you don't jump to the conclusion that you're being haunted versus checking out your mental health. So be very clear, and if you're experiencing changes in emotion and that type of thing, then be sure to contact a healthcare professional and first check if the situation is physical. Because it could, of course, be something to do with different events going on in your life right now. There could be a neurochemical imbalance. So first check the physical factors, and then if those have been ruled out, look at other factors and reach out for help and support. Part 7 has to do with research and legalities. She talks about being serious and responsible with the research. She goes through the start and steps of when you're investigating for a client. So she goes through the steps. So if you're going to support someone who has called you and asking for help, there's a whole series of things that you should be doing, which includes interviewing the client, doing research on the location, which could be looking on the internet, going to the library for old news articles and information, perhaps going to City Hall. She goes over the different forms that need to be signed in terms of agreements, keeping in mind here that unfortunately, although there are a number of people that do it, Trespassing is never a good idea when you're trying to do paranormal investigating. And there are a number of different reasons for that. It isn't just the fact that you're trespassing, it could be unsafe, there could be hazardous material, but the other part of it is if you're gathering evidence for the paranormal field and you've been trespassing, that in itself could sway some thoughts about your credibility and accountability. It also talks about having your equipment insured because a number of the pieces, particularly now, can be quite expensive and not easy to replace. Part 8 is about gear and technology. She talks about the importance of your observation skills as well as clear and concise record keeping being step 1. Another piece of equipment, of course, is your ears. What are you hearing? What are the sounds? Being able to identify and know whether the sounds you're hearing are a building settling, something else going on in the area, or is it something paranormal? Step 2, of course, is to capture something, whether it's visual or audio, and that good equipment is not necessarily the most expensive equipment you'll find. I've seen a number of investigators who use cat balls. They take quite a bit of effort to light up, and they set them around hallways and different locations. Now, I don't do investigations, I'm a cat owner, but I think it's rather cute that the toys that my kids enjoy also serve a purpose for paranormal investigators, and it's very low tech, so you don't have to worry about batteries or things running out. As she goes through the different types of equipment and the different things they do, again, it stands out because this book is from 2011 compared to Journeys, which listed different types of equipment because it was an older book. And some of these pieces now mentioned in the 101 book have recently been developed. So when she talks about the equipment here, it's more like if you follow any of the paranormal channels on YouTube, the items she talks about is the types of things that they're using. She mentions clothing and what you should be wearing when you're out on an investigation. So keep in mind the weather, of course, and where you may be heading out to. So make sure that you're dressing warm or have layers. There is a section on how to record EVPs, and I'll be talking more about that next month when I do a review on the book Talking to the Dead by George Newry. The author mentions a ghost box, which is white noise from an AM tuner, and that you can build your own. At the end of the video, I'll be mentioning a site where you can find plans for that if it's something that you're interested in. Part 9 focuses on teamwork. So she goes through having the team leader, team members being accountable, and again, being mindful that if you're part of a team, what you're saying and doing impacts the entire team. Roles that people have. So, are some people actively out investigating? Perhaps part of your team does the review and editing for you afterwards. A team functions best when you have a variety of different skills and abilities, and people pull together for a common good. The author also mentions having sensitives or psychics as part of your team, as well as photographers and videographers. So, again, looking at all the different things that you need to consider and skills and talents that people can bring to the collective. Part 10, the author talks about hobby or profession. In my opinion, this is very important, and you need to be clear on why are you doing this type of work or looking into this subject area. Are you hoping to learn something for yourself? Maybe you have questions about the other side, or are you serious about helping discover what the paranormal could be What are ghosts and spirits? Why do they tend to linger? How do we make contact with them? That type of thing. What I also find frustrating, and I've mentioned the term a few times, is clickbait. Now, when I refer to clickbait, I'm not talking about the top 5 paranormal channels. To me, and a number of other people who watch them, they're simply storytelling entertainment. In fact, if you go to their About page, they're very clear about the fact that they are finding clips and telling stories, but they are not paranormal investigators. And that tends to get confused a lot. When I say clickbait, I'm referring to the people who call themselves real paranormal investigators and yet have been numerous times caught faking, editing, setting things up. In other words, they're reflecting negatively on the people who are doing actual investigations and sharing what they're doing on YouTube. So unfortunately, the clickbait channels, who I find interesting, tend to have a huge viewership, as well as viewers who will argue left, right, and center that they're legit, they're real, when unfortunately there are a number of people who are well aware of the fact that, no, I'm sorry, they're not real. They fake things and they're not honest on their About page in regard to they're making content based on paranormal information. So if you are following a paranormal channel, please be sure to do a check, read the About page, perhaps talk to other people. Because as I follow 2 debunking channels, I am well aware of the number of people who get duped on a fairly regular basis and are very angry and very disappointed when they discover that a channel that they've been supporting, particularly with memberships, is in fact not real paranormal, it's clickbait. The author talks about the fact that investigators typically do not charge clients for their services. On page 198, the author gives a list of suggestions and ideas for making an income if you're interested in the paranormal field. She stresses, and I agree, be professional and have standards. The author also mentions the importance of research, networking with other people. One suggestion she had earlier in the book was about attending classes or attending conventions. So that's a good way to find people who are interested in the subject, like yourself, as well as information sharing. And this sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. Sometimes people get very territorial about different things. But again, the paranormal can only grow and develop as more people share information. Then the paranormal field may finally start to gain some respectability, and we may begin to find some answers to the questions that have been around for a very long time. Her book ends with an appendix. One are different websites to check out, and I actually went to them. I'll leave links to these in the description box down below and in the comments down below. So the Keyport Paranormal.com. Keyport Paranormal.com. If you're interested in how to build your own ghost box, there are directions and there are clear instructions there, as well as a variety of other information. Parapsych.org. The Parapsychological Association has been around since 1957. It is an international association. They have a tab which lets you know where you can take online distance education courses through universities. I am sad to say Canada has the goose egg. You can also have memberships with this association. A student membership, in other words, someone who is interested in the paranormal or you're taking courses on the paranormal, is $50 US, just to give you an idea. I didn't look at the other amounts. They also have a tab for events, and they offer online or in-person events. So if you're interested in the paranormal, doing some networking, or just reading about information, it's a great website and perhaps an interesting starting point in an area of new interest. Ghost Hunting 101 offers a variety of information. There are articles and links to other groups. When the book was originally published, there were just links for the United States. I checked out this link myself this morning, and they now have a section for Canada. So if you're from Canada and curious about that, there are a few links that you can check out.